Hi everyone. Welcome. This is Rachel at MENA S&R again, and I am very excited for the conversation today. We're going to be talking to Fareen Parvez. Okay, always correct my pronunciation. I ask every guest to do that. She's associate professor of sociology at the University of Massachusetts, but right now she has a visiting position at Harvard Divinity School, where she is a research associate in the Women's Studies department.
Women's Studies and Religion program.
Okay, great. Well, Fareen, it's so wonderful to get to talk to you today. And usually we ask people to start with how they came to the field, what they began working on, what they're working on now, any trends they see into the future. It's a really free-flowing conversation, so feel free to jump in anywhere you think is most relevant.
Yeah. So my research for this particular project has been in Morocco on the field of spirit possession. And there's a very long history of studying this in anthropology. So it's qualitative research that I carried out in Fez. And it kind of came about from my first book, which was based on my dissertation. I was looking at Islamic movements in France and in India, and I did comparative ethnography. So I spent a lot of time, it was also ethnography in working class neighborhoods in France, looking at Muslim communities. And towards the end of my research, there was a kind of a little outbreak in the community I was in of jinn possession, and one of my closest interlocutors actually became afflicted. So I kind of firsthand saw that, and I was kind of thinking, what is this about? And of course, as a sociologist, looking at the wider context of what was happening in France with, more and more anti-veiling legislation, and women in this particular, more Orthodox community, just feeling very, very targeted. And so it felt like a very tense summer when these debates were unfolding in France, and then this also happening with these these cases of jinn possession. So I switched contexts, and decided to go to a Muslim majority country and do something a little different. So I went to Morocco to study this.
Wow, how long have you been doing your research in Morocco now?
So it's complete now, and it was actually just 4 months, which is a little bit long for, a little bit short for ethnography, but it was very immersive and very intense. So, I was in the field basically every day, observing kind of clinical sessions, and doing interviews with people who are possessed, and then also some of the healing practitioners. So it's 4 months in Fez, and I observed like about 25 healing sessions and did about 27 interviews. And I worked with a couple of research collaborators who were local, because my language skills were not great. And, such a wildly different context from what I knew. So I needed some assistance.
Wow. So do you want to share with us some of your takeaways from that research? You're writing it up now, or it's already been published?
I'm writing it up now. Yeah. So there's the component that kind of speaks more directly to the issue of science and religion, and that interface. So I have a manuscript now that I'll send out soon. I'm co-authoring with a graduate student at UMass Amherst. So that takes on more directly the question of science religion. I also want to write a little bit about the gender component of what's going on, and I can say more about that in a bit. And then I plan to do a book, which I think will kind of foreground the ethnography in kind of a little bit more narrative style, where I pick 6 or 7 cases and kind of really go into them in the book. So on the science and religion, there's a long history of there's a big literature, going back a long time, which, it's kind of rooted in kind of racist, Orientalist assumptions that Muslims despise science, and Islam is kind of inherently incompatible, like more so than other religions, with Western science. um, and that's largely been like an outdated mode of thinking, at least in the scholarship. So and as soon as you start doing field work, of course you see how it's so much more complicated than that. um, so so I was kind of looking, in this case, on the relationship between kind of, I guess, biomedicine, and religious healing. And, it's the relationship is complicated in the sense that people are always changing their positions, for one thing. Um, I'm thinking of one case where one of the practitioners of Islamic healing of jinn possession, um, basically changed his mind and decided the whole thing was like placebo effect. But he continued to work that way as a religious healer, but he no longer really believed it. So that's one example of how complicated his own relationship is to religious healing, faith healing, and in Western science. There were many people were quite disaffected from healthcare, like medical care institutions and hospitals, had very negative experiences. For women, their type of sufferings often just not legible, in the medical care system, and they just find more connection with traditional healers or religious healers. Those two things are not the same.
And were there people who were pursuing treatment in a variety of systems simultaneously, or?
Yes, and a lot of other researchers have kind of shown this, like this kind of pluralism. Basically, you try the psychiatrist, you try the medical doctors, you get a brain scan done, you go to like a traditional healer who does like divination, and then there's this whole new field called Ruqya al-Sharia, and this is the more like Islamic healing, and it's basically quite simple at its core, which is reading verses from the Quran to the patient to kind of speak to the jinn, and sort of battle the jinn or convince the jinn to leave and leave the person alone. So people kind of go in and out of these different systems. And in some ways, whatever works is what they will start to believe in. I'm thinking of one a heartbreaking case of a father whose 11-year-old son was possessed, and he absolutely did not believe in jinn possession, or religious healing or traditional healing. But I think the persistence of his son's symptoms and the way he would act out his possession, in combination with kind of feeling disrespected in the hospital system by medical doctors, he kind of reluctantly started to change his mind and think that maybe there's really something to this, and but he was confused and troubled by it. So yeah, in terms of the question, are people with Western science or not? It's just so much more complicated than that. It has to do with their concrete relationships, their experiences, and whether they find healing in different systems. And often they don't. In the Western scientific world.
And was there a network of any of these healers in terms of how people found them, or in terms of relating to one another, or I'm just curious of the whole system there that you encountered.
Yeah. So in Fez, I would say it's mostly like word of mouth, and a network. I mean, I think there are some people who have like little business cards that they make. And one of the things I talk about in this paper is that the field of Ruqya al-Sharia, again with the religious healers, they are trying to appear more professional and modernized, because otherwise there's a lot of stigma to this kind of work. The state is not particularly happy about this, the Moroccan state. So it's not interested in kind of allowing it to become more respectable and modern. but otherwise, yeah, it's kind of word of mouth.
And there are male and female practitioners as well
They're
as
mostly
patients.
they're mostly men, but there are some who are women. And there was one woman that I got to observe her sessions and participate in one, which was interesting, and also interview her. So, and she would carry out kind of group healing sessions. So, 15 women or so would kind of lie down on the floor in her space while she would do the recitation and kind of navigate the relationship with these women's various gyms. Um,
And that was novel. Only the woman practitioner worked in groups.
yeah, I didn't see that with others. Yeah, I observed most closely two men Rukia practitioners and then this one woman.
That's so fascinating. So did you want to speak more to the gender issue you were saying in terms of the intersection there, or?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's generally thought that women tend to be more vulnerable to possession than men. Um, it's pretty mixed though, so I don't know if that's necessarily the case. And of course, it's not like there are statistical studies about this. Um, but yeah, it's pretty mixed in terms of what I observed in the clinical sessions, but probably more women than men. Um,
And coming in as a woman researcher, you said there were a lot of new cultural norms to get used to, and obviously, you know, beyond the language, all sorts of I'm just curious what it was like coming in as a woman researcher and making these connections and
yeah, so
that.
again, it was essential that I had local collaborators who kind of knew this world and um, had known these practitioners over a period of years. Um, so it was interesting. I think because I was a foreigner, I was much less, I was not actually treated with suspicion and compared to some of my other field sites, like in France, where I was constantly a little bit under suspicion. I think because being possessed uh, is a source of stigma. My being an outsider, I think it was clear that I wasn't going to gossip about anybody. I wouldn't even know how. And so in some ways, it was acceptable that I was there. I did choose to, to dress in traditional ways, and I wore a hijab. Although my research associate did not, my collaborator translator did not. Um, and a lot of healing sessions tend to be collective, and the therapeutic relationship is not necessarily a one-on-one like here in the US. So there could be several family members, and then my just sort of being there as a community member was okay, actually.
Are you thinking of doing any parallel studies in the US, or what's your next site that you'd like to encounter and pursue?
I think I'm probably done with this research agenda within
Okay.
the session. It was definitely fascinating. It was a little bit out of um, it's not related to, to some other research that I'm doing, which has much more to do with political economy issues. But it was also very, very rich, of course, like a lot of qualitative projects, kind of life changing in a way, to really think about the nature of suffering, how people seek healing and what it even means to build, you know, um, people who kind of, I met several people who felt like their gyms were never going to leave them, and so they would try different things, but eventually came to just an acceptance that they were always going to be possessed. Um, and in some cases, I had one woman who said, well, she loves me, like the gym loves me, she takes it easy on me. So it's interesting how they come to just live with the situation. Um, Another thing that was really fascinating actually was a lot of gyms are inherited. And so, I'm thinking a lot about the relationship to the mother and the grandmother and how they're passed down, and what are the parallels to like the concept of intergenerational trauma, which we talk about in the US context. Um, so I'm done with this project, but a lot of things still to think about and write about.
Wow.
Mm.
And do you have any tips for other young scholars who are interested in pursuing this type of research agenda, or anything else you'd like to share?
Mhm. Um, Gosh, well, the ethnography was difficult. I wrote a personal essay after my last fieldwork trip about a year ago called "Ethnography at Midlife," and it was the challenges of doing this kind of intensive, also physical work, in some ways, um, at midlife, and what it was like. Um, so I talk in the essay. I got sick at one point towards the end of my research. It was not getting better, and then I started to wonder if I got possessed, or if I had been victim to the evil eye or something. And I couldn't believe that I was thinking this way. And um, but one of the things that was really interesting and challenging about this kind of research is you're forced to really, be open, like in terms of ontology of this, right? Like, what if this is all real? And if that's the case, how do you live with that? How do you deal with that? And relate to that. So I guess just being open, um, but also being prepared, because it can be kind of hard, and not imposing our own, Western scientific perspective on other communities. I think I did feel sort of, bad sometimes as a researcher. Like, I wondered what people thought as I was observing them, if they kind of knew that I didn't necessarily believe in it, that I'm coming from a very, Western scientific worldview, um, but I don't want to kind of impose that into their space, you know? So I don't know if that's much advice, but it's something to think about for people trying this out, this
For
kind of research.
sure. And do you see the parallels between when you came home and you were looking at sort of medical treatment and issues in the US? So it sort of changed your perspective a bit on the science and religion relation, also in more closer circles to where you live on a daily basis, or?
Yeah, I mean, it's something I still need to think about more, but I think, one of the themes that came up too in my research was that the Ruqya practitioners, the Islamic healers, they felt like the healing relationship, the relationship between the healer and the person possessed, you're making a spiritual connection with them. And, there's great work in anthropology uh, that also kind of goes into this, and, and how that's so important. So I write a little bit about, the so-called patient, needs to open up to a state where they could be healed. Um, and that opening up happens through the relationship with the healer. So that relationship is very important. Um, and of course, that's like the antithesis of what we experience in the medical care system, and also in the US, where your provider barely looks up from their computer, right? They don't even see your face, like, as you're trying to explain why you're suffering, right? So it's a really problematic relationship, and I think people needing to go outside of that system makes a lot of sense.
Wow. And anything in particular about the Middle East? This is your first research experience there, but
Yeah.
are you considering doing other research in the area here?
Um, I'm not sure. It does. I'm not sure. I mean, I never want to say, that some doors are closed. I don't like to close any doors, so
Mm.
you never know where things can take you. Darija, Moroccan Arabic, was definitely a difficult language to begin learning, and so I would want to kind of take some time to really delve back into the language training before I were to go back. Um, I think, it would be interesting in any kind of ethnographic project. You always want to know, 10 years later, what happened, how does the field look? And some of those individuals, did they stay in that field, in that work? Did they leave? Did somebody actually did they get better, get worse? And so yeah, I probably want to do some sort of follow up.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That would be exciting. So I don't know if you want to share about any other projects or other directions, or any thoughts you had if you've found yourself a little bit from your description sort of parachuting into this field of science and religion, and tasting it, and experiencing it and doing some research, and then how it connects to some of the other things you've done, or anything else you want to share. I know because of both of our time constraints, we might be coming to the end of this conversation. So
Sure.
anything else you wanted to add?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think from the beginning with this subfield of science and religion, it was hard to get my bearings, in part because there's always the question in any grant or project, well, what do we mean by these categories, right? So what do we mean by science? Okay, it's actually Western science, right? And then of course, what do we mean by religion? And so I think, as I started doing some research on Moroccan history and Islam and science, I think appreciating that, there are indigenous knowledge systems, so there was a kind of Islamic science, and that in reading about that, the violence imposed by French colonialism in Morocco, and how much of those knowledge systems were dismissed, or actively, undermined and things, or stolen in some cases. So I think, learning about that was eye opening.
And do you
So
think the field is broadening a bit? When you said like there's one science that it's looking at, and it's looking at this Western science, you don't think it's sort of getting a bit more nuanced and diversified in that regard, or you think there's
mhm.
still a ways to go? Is that sort of what I'm hearing you say?
I think there probably is a ways to go.
Okay.
I mean, I think in sociology there's definitely an openness to learning about it. I mean, most of us are not trained in this very, I guess kind of cross-cultural comparative, methods. And so we kind of tend to impose a little bit based out of the US, and assume that they're in other places when they may not be relevant in other places. Um, so, or, just understanding how traditional healing and practices like possession really, withstood colonial violence, despite all this attempt to undermine these things, that they actually still persevere, even against, kind of reformist brands of Islam that also, don't like these kinds of things. Um, but yeah, so this relates to my other research project right now, which is in India, and I'm actually looking at very different, looking at the sociology of debt, of household debt, but it relates in the sense that there are, there's a whole tradition of Islamic ethics related to financial questions, and community responsibility, around economic life. Even things like the ban on usury and stuff like that. So that's, kind of wanting to take that seriously in my research. So I guess that's a bit of a thread, looking at, Islamic ethics, basically.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. I'd love to see that essay, that reflective essay that you wrote. So maybe you can forward it along, and I could share it along when this interview goes live to the network.
Yeah, sure.
Um, yeah, and looking forward to reading more about your study. So thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks for your interest.
Take care.